This is part 2 of my conversation with my guest and expert witness, Dr. Tony Campolo. Tony is a Professor Emeritus of Eastern University, a sociologist, a theologian, and an extraordinary communicator. We talked together about the afterword of my book, We Shape Our Systems, Then They Shape Us. I so love talking with Tony because it's absolutely true that I've learned more from Tony about sociology, about theology, and about communication than from any other person on earth. Tony has been my friend for 40 or more years, and why he chose to befriend me, I haven't got a clue, but the benefit has all been mine. I'm sure you'll enjoy his words. Does that make sense to you, Tony?
Indeed, it does. The thing is that politicians have a problem. They have to get elected year after year after year, and therefore it makes them into pretenders. There was a pop song some years ago that should have been ascribed to every politician I know. It was called, They Call Me the Great Pretender. Do you remember that song?
I do.
They Call Me the Great Pretender. In a sense, every politician is a great pretender, and the pretense is that he or she knows the answer to the problem being faced by the community. I've got the answers, trust me, and I'll work it out for all of you. And of course, he knows or she knows that the answers to the problems are far more complex than any one person can solve. But so it goes on. All this is to say, it's not the politicians that create the system. It's we ordinary people who create the systems, and they are subject to the systems that we create for them. We tell them what we expect them to do and what we expect them to be. We expect them to be problem solvers. And when it's campaign time, they have to come up with some statement that sounds like a reasonable solution to the problems that we face. And of course, they're doing the best they can, but they don't have the answers. None of us have the answers. As a matter of fact, to go back to a book that both of us respect, namely the Bible, it says in Ephesians 6:12, brothers and sisters, we wrestle not just against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and rulers in high places. Emile Durkheim, the great French sociologist, called this reality that we're all struggling against social facts. A social fact or a principality and power is any supra-human entity that influences human behavior. In the end, your initial statement said it well. We create the system, and thereafter, the system creates us. We are products of the very system that we ourselves have created. And your illustration earlier connotates the reality that most of us are even unaware of this fact, that we are the creators of the system that creates us and makes us into who we are and who we are supposed to be. And often the system is so gigantic, it's impossible to get a handle on it. The system involves the art that we appreciate, the cinema, the movies we go to see, the music we listen to and embrace.
It's all to do, isn't it, Tony, I guess, with the assumptions we make about life and the way that life is. An assumption is always a conclusion that you reach without it really running through your brain.
Yeah.
It's a problem. Durkheim, as I understand it, what he said was he went further, didn't he? It's not just that we create these systems, but we end up almost worshiping them.
That's right. As a matter of fact, we always make our concepts of God part of the system. that controls us. Please note, I said we create gods that legitimate the systems. In other words, here's this great system. How do we take it seriously? The answer is we convince ourselves that the systems that are impacting our lives and molding us are ordained by God. They have religious legitimation, and thus anybody that opposes the system opposes God. Now, you and I lived through the 60s, in which there was a whole generation of young people who questioned the system and began to raise questions about how it could be changed. However, those who raised the questions never took the time to work out answers to their own questions. They were waiting for somebody out there to come up with the answers. And that's where politicians can gain their mileage, to pretend that they have the answers. In reality, they're just as confused as the rest of us are. That's the kind of world we live in.
So do you think, Tony, that what we need is, instead of, I know where you are in the States, the systems, this 4-year system that goes round each time. Here we can go a little bit longer, up to 5 years, but we're always going around that political cycle. Everything's got to be fixed in the cycle. Whereas we know, don't we, that a lot of the giant issues we face need policies that stretch across 10, 20, 30 years and are held in place, policies that aren't going to swing backwards and forwards to the left, to the right, or whatever. And thinking about, the young people of the 60s and the things they fought for in terms of freedoms. Here we are faced with this huge issue around our own sustainability as a human race and the sustainability of the planet, as we think about the problem of climate change and ecology. And so many people feel like that we have to tackle this giant issue, but all we get is short-term policies that chop and change. What do we do when we're caught in that kind of system, when we think, I can't make any difference?
Well, we can make a difference. We can make a huge difference. But we need to be people who know a visionary when we see one. But we need visionaries. There's a passage of scripture that says, when the young no longer have visions and the old no longer have dreams, the people perish. And that's exactly where we are right now. We're a society that's perishing because there are no visions, no dreams that are luring us into a better tomorrow. We have to start dreaming. We have to start having visions, and we have to start listening to those who do have dreams and visions. The United States came into being because some men, and they were men, looked at the system that was governing their lives and said, it doesn't have to be this way. And they dreamed up a new system and wrote it up in what we call a constitution. And that vision guided our country for a long period of time. But it's obvious now that the vision and the dreams that gave birth to America are no longer viable, are no longer working. You talked about the fact that every 4 years we end up with a new government or a new system. We're not as bad as the Brits, who seem to be always on the verge of pulling out support for the prime minister and his government, and a new prime minister and a new government coming into play.
We keep the same government, we just keep swapping the prime minister. Once a year, at least.
Well, if you don't like the prime minister and the government he's trying to establish, if you're British, just wait 10 minutes. It'll change. It's as simple as that.
But this point is a serious one, isn't it? You talk about America, and the world knows about the political problems that are confronting America at the moment, and asks huge questions about those. How do you form a vision that moves America forward? as you say, the Constitution did that to begin with, but it's outdated. It doesn't work. Look at the issue of gun control.
I was just going to cite that, that there is no gun control in the United States. So since the first of the year, there have been 425 mass shootings, and nobody has come up with an image and a vision as to how to change that, how to stop that, how to break the cycle of violence that keeps repeating itself over and over again. I think this can be said. There was a movement started by a group of sociologists about 50 years ago called communitarianism. And they said the only way to change things is to have a politician whose primary purpose is to call people together in groups that are small enough where everybody's voice can be given serious consideration and see what emerges from that. And that requires a new kind of leadership that doesn't seek re-election as the only goal. It was said by Disraeli, one of your prime ministers, a long while ago. The difference between a politician and a statesman is that a politician is always looking to the next election, whereas the statesman is always looking to the next generation. And that's what we need right now. We need some statesmen or stateswomen, especially when dealing with the issue that you raised just a moment ago, the environment. When you start talking about the environment and the things that need to be changed, you see the problem. We all know that the gases coming from automobiles need to be ended, that we've got to stop this dependence on fossil fuel. Everybody says, yes, we do. Everybody says, we agree. But the minute you start talking about people not using their automobiles, a rebellion begins, and the politicians who are worried about the next election. No, you can't win an election if you threaten the use of automobiles. And until we face that, so it becomes important for local leaders. We have a failure of leadership, both in the United Kingdom and in the United States, a failure of leadership to look beyond the next election, to look to the future and to support policies that will ensure a better future, and then to rally support for that vision. A leader is not somebody who sees in which direction the crowd is moving and runs out in front of it and yells, "Follow me." But that's what we've gotten. When someone decides to run for public office, the first thing he or she does is takes a poll of the constituency, take a survey. You became involved in politics in many ways. As you know, I ran for the U.S. Congress in 1976, so I became involved in politics. And thing is, there is need for an overriding vision of what we want our society to become, what we want the systems that mold us to be. We need to have a vision of that. And until somebody comes up with it, and in Bible times, they were always looking for the prophet. And the prophet was the person who brought two things into play. Walter Brueggemann says the prophet has these two characteristics. He or she has a new vision of the future, and secondly, is able to articulate a workable plan to get there. They're the two things that a prophet needs. In the ancient days, the ancient Jews constantly prayed for a new prophet. That's what we need to be doing in the United States and in the United Kingdom. Because if we don't come up with a new prophet, people pretending to be prophets like Donald Trump emerge on the scene and pretend they have the answers. And they speak with such force and with such convincing power that people follow them. Right now, I would say this, that we have people who will fall for anything because there's no strong prophet in our midst. The ancient people hoped for and prayed for a prophet, and they knew what to look for when one came. If you and I would look for the ultimate prophet, we would hold up Jesus. Muslims would hold up Muhammad. Taoists would hold up Laodicea. There have in times past these personalities that have emerged in history who were prophets, who had an alternative view of what the world should be. When they asked Jesus what his view of the future was, he answered, "It's the kingdom of God. I have come to declare that the kingdom of God is among you." It's breaking into history right now. And the kingdom of God is when society is restructured in accord with the will of God. And what does it mean to do that? Now, in the early 1900s, there was the forming of the American Sociological Association, and they had a journal that was put out by the University of Chicago called the American Sociological Review. And what they did was they said to leading sociologists, we want you to imagine what it would look like if a particular institution was to restructure itself in accord with the will of God. Now, I say that in the abstract, but I find that when you say the will of God, my secular friends know what I'm talking about. It's the society that ought to be. We all have a vision of what society ought to be down deep inside. It's a society in which every person is respected, every person's views are taken seriously. It's a society in which it's safe to be in a minority. Somebody asked me recently how I would define a democracy, and I would say that the general definition of a democracy that is accepted around the world is when the majority of the people are heard and when their views are translated into policy. I don't agree with that definition. I think a democracy is where it's safe to be in a minority. And the truth is that Hitler had the majority of the German people on his side as he pursued his fascist policies. The problem with Germany during those years was that it was not safe to disagree with Hitler or what the majority was prescribing. The concept of rule by the majority is not good enough for me. A good society, a democracy, is where it's safe to be in the minority. Whereas if you disagree with the majority, you're not put to death or ostracized. The reality is that out there in the world in which we live, there are a lot of people who have a lot of good, important things to say, and they're not being heard, and their voices are being silenced. Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote a classic in sociology called Democracy in America, once analyzed the American society and democracy as Americans understood it, and said that America is great, and his next line was really important, because its people are great. And if the American people cease to be good and great, America will cease to be good and great. Well, I'm afraid that day is coming. We are not good and great people in the sense that we should be.
Would you say, Tony, that, one of the things I argue in my book, I feel passionately about, that people are good and they need the opportunity to be allowed to be great? If I look at the situation here in the UK with the fracturing of so many of the good systems that we need to protect young people, to create hope for families, to level up and to create opportunity, a level playing field, a playing field of equality for people through life. One of the things we need is participation. And I argue through my book that that's what we've always sought after. We've been pointed towards, and yet people have always been denied it. It strikes me that a vision for the future, the only vision that works, is a vision for the future where we empower local people in local communities to participate in creating safe communities. I've got a friend. She works for Oasis. Actually, she still works for Oasis. But years and years and years ago, what am I thinking? I'm thinking about 10, 13 years ago now. We went for a troubled summer when there were riots in many of our cities. Gangs formed and young people rioted. Buildings were burned. Shops were looted, etc., etc. And we had just built a brand new school building with government money. And it had cost almost £30 million to build this wonderful building. And it was in one of our summers. And I'd just gone away on holiday as these riots broke out. And I was out of the country. And I got this phone call.
That sounds like the problem right there.
Yeah.
When the problems emerge, Steve Chalke and his likes go on vacation.
That's exactly what happened. I was away in the summer. I'd only been away for a day and my phone rang, my mobile rang, and the leader of this council of the local government area where we were working, he told me, he said, you may have seen these riots on TV last night. He said, well, there was a giant building in our area that was burnt to the ground that's still burning. But the police tell us that tonight your school is going to be burnt down. So I said to him, well, if the police had told you, can the police do something about it? No, they're overstretched. Every police officer's leave has been cancelled. They're all involved around the country and around London. There's nothing that can be done. So I said, well, if they know that a gang is going to burn the building down, can we tell the fire brigade? If the fire brigade turns out, they can protect the building. No, we can't do that. There are likely to be so many fires. The fire brigade will only be able to attend, so I'm told, once a building's alight. So I said, well, why are you phoning me? Because I'm on the other side of the world. And he said, I'm phoning you to tell you that tonight your building's going to burn down, so you have to get everyone out of it. All the night staff, all of the cleaners, all of the facilities managers, anyone who's in the building needs to be away from that building. You need to shut it down. And he put the phone down. That was the end of the call. And I thought about this, Tony, and I thought, what on earth can I do about this? I can't get back. There's nothing I can do. I can't get, the police aren't coming. The fire brigade aren't coming. What can I do? And I had this idea. I phoned up somebody who worked for Oasis because we ran a youth club in the area as well. And I said to her name's Kat. I said, Kat, I've got a problem. And I told her that story. And she said, well, what shall I do? And I said, I don't know. But I said, it's your job, Kat, if you can, to stop the building being burnt down. Well, it was about 4:00 in the afternoon. So I said, you've got a couple of hours, perhaps 3 hours to come up with a plan, but you have to save that building from being burnt, because if a school building's burnt down in that community, the stigma of that and the shame of that is going to live with this community for generations. So do what you can. Well, the extraordinary thing is the school building never burnt down. And the next morning, Kat talked to me and she phoned me. She said, it didn't burn, Steve. There was lots of rioting around the town, but our building didn't burn. And I said, so what did you do? She said, well, I came up with this idea. She said, with the young people in the area, we often do a cake bake. So I invited all the kids down to the youth club and we baked as many cakes as we could. And then all night we sat outside the school building and we handed out cakes. And when the kids came, we gave them cakes and we sat and we talked with them and we played music and they danced. But the school building survived. And for me, Tony, that's a wonderful example of how communities are supposed to work. Not that communities are supposed to end up in a struggle and a challenge and be pulled out, literally out of the fire in that way. But Kat was an empowered youth worker who worked with young people and the community took ownership. And it strikes me that the revolution that we need is for people to be engaged in their communities and care about their communities, to love their communities and build their communities, rather than communities being run by professionals, whilst the ordinary men and women and young people are left out and disempowered. That, I believe, is a manifesto for hope.
Well, I think the people in the United Kingdom are ready to elect you prime minister, because I think everybody down deep inside would say yes to what you just said, that what has happened is that everything's become so big that people feel lost in the system, when the big thing is broken down into smaller units, namely viable communities in which participants come together and express what they're thinking, and little by little come up with an alternative vision of the future, an alternative vision.
Tony, I wondered whether you tell that story you told me before about Einstein. Now, you studied for a short while under Albert Einstein, didn't you? You know the story you told me about Einstein on the train and getting lost.
Yeah.
Tell us that story, because it seems to me to be so relevant to all of this.
That's such a good story. As a matter of fact, as a preacher, which you are, it's no surprise that you should remember and use that story. Einstein was on a train leaving Princeton, heading north, and the conductor came by, and Einstein was reaching in his pockets and he couldn't find his ticket. And he looked in his briefcase and he couldn't find it. And finally, the conductor said, "Dr. Einstein, don't worry about it. I know who you are, and you don't have to worry about your ticket." So he went on about his business. A little while later, he came back, and Einstein was still looking for his ticket in his pockets and in the briefcase. And the conductor said, "Dr. Einstein, I told you that I know who you are, and you don't have to worry about your ticket." At that, Einstein stood up straight against the conductor and said, "Young man, I know who I am. What I want to know is where I'm going." And I think that's the problem. We have no clear definition of where we're going, what we want. I remember when my granddaughter was about 5 years old, I took her into a candy store and I said, "Miranda, you can have whatever you want." About 10 minutes later, I came back to where she was and she's crying. I said, "What's the matter? I told you you can have everything you want." He said, "But Grandpa, I don't know what I want." And in a real sense, that's exactly where we are as a people. We don't know what we want. And if we don't know what we want, it's pretty hard to satisfy us. My granddaughter's problem was she went into this candy store and there were so many options, she didn't know what to do. There were so many choices to be made. She didn't know which would be the right choice. And I think that's where we are as a society, that people all around us are overwhelmed with options. There are so many choices that they can make. And in such a milieu of multiple choices, that in reality, frustration overwhelms the individual. What we need is leadership which will listen to the people and see if there was some common goal and vision that they want to actualize in their society and in their lifetime. That hasn't been done.
No, absolutely.
The leaders that we have now come around and they tell us what the vision of the future should be. The leaders in today's world try to convince us that there is an option that they have chosen which is best for everybody, and it's not going to work. Communitarianism, as is being facilitated in today's society. You want to look that up on your computer.
And Tony, that really brings us back at the end to right where I started my book. Actually, in the introduction to the book, I simply tell the story of how in the middle of the Second World War in 1942, in December of 1942, a little known academic who'd been working on a report for the government wandered to number 10 Downing Street and posted the report to them, to the Prime Minister that he'd been asked to put together. The Prime Minister at that time in the Second World War was Winston Churchill, the famous Winston Churchill. But the man who posted this report, his name was William Beveridge, and the report became known as the Beveridge Report. And what it suggested was that after the war, a national service should be set up, a welfare service that cared for everyone so that no one fell into poverty, so that everyone in the UK would find the support and the help that they needed, young and old. He put forward this plan, and after the Second World War, the then government, began to implement it. They set up what we call the welfare state to assist people who were sick or unemployed, to create a pension for people who were retired. And then in 1948, they put in place what we call the National Health Service, free healthcare for all. But the thing is this, 2 years before it was all put into place, Beveridge wrote another report. And in it, he said this: it will never work. It's fatally flawed. And it won't work because the way that you've chosen to put my ideas into place is to give them all to professionals, paid professionals, and to disempower local communities, to leave local people out of leadership, to reject those voluntary agencies, those faith agencies, those churches, those other community groups that have given so much. You've professionalized everything and you've disempowered the people. Give the power back to the people. And that's still the quest. And in my book, A Manifesto for Hope, I believe that in the end, that's what it boils down to. Allowing people who know where we're headed and know what's needed in communities to take the lead. We build community, as you say, together, not by leaving it to others. That is my manifesto for hope.
There's another story I need to tell you. At the beginning of World War II, when the Nazis invaded Denmark, the leaders of the churches didn't know what to do. So the bishop of the churches called all the clergy together for a meeting. And they were all saying, "Bishop, what should we do now?" And he said, "First, we have to answer the question, who we are. And once we know who we are, we'll know what to do." I think that's a very profound statement. We don't know who we are, and therefore we don't know what to do. We've got to get some clarity on who we are as an American people, who we are as a British people, who are we really? And because until we can figure out who we are, we'll never figure out what we're going to do. But your second statement is so important, that this problem is not going to be solved by people at the top telling us who we are. That's what Hitler was. Hitler told the German people at a point at which they didn't know who they were. He told them who they were. He gave them a definition of self. And that's where the mistake was made. The people themselves have to come up with a definition of who they are and what their values are. The British society, like the American society, have no values anymore. Their values have evaporated. So we need to facilitate getting people together. Democracy is created not in the halls of Congress, say the leading sociologists. Community is created around the water cooler during the break in the workday, as people on the floor gather around and talk about things. What are they saying? What are the values that are emerging out of those informal discussions? We have to have those all over the place. And we need to involve massive numbers of people in a discussion as to who we are, what our values are, and what the future is that we want to see implemented. And until we can answer those questions, the problem is going to get increasingly worse. And I think we all feel that. And I hope this book that you're publishing will encourage that kind of communal participation. During the 60s, they came up with a phrase that sums it up. They called it participatory democracy. Participatory democracy, a democracy in which all people participated in a discussion. You were about to say something exceedingly profound. I could just sense it oozing through your nostrils.
I wasn't at all, Tony. I was going to thank you for all that you contributed to this. It's been great talking with you, and your wisdom is as profound and meaningful as ever. Thank you very much.
Thank you for allowing me to put my 2 cents into a multi-billion-dollar discussion that must go on and must take place. And you and I and others like us must not only write books and give speeches about these things, but must get our hands dirty as you have and begin to create what we call voluntary associations, where the kinds of things we've been talking about begin to happen, because the destiny of the planet depends upon it. And certainly the survival of our nations depend upon it. And without dreams and visions, the people perish. So dream on, Steve Chalke. Come up with visions. Don't let the visions die. Don't let this vision of participatory democracy at the grassroots level, this communitarianism, fade away. May we do our best to lend support to those who are working for this kind of society. Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, said, the only thing that can change society is small groups of people coming together, exchanging points of view, generating a consensus, and then committing themselves to action. It's the only thing that has ever changed the world, and it's the only thing that will. So you've got Margaret Mead on your side, and you've got me on your side. Besides Margaret Mead and Tony Campolo, who else do you need?
That's a good question. No one. Thank you.
Thank you very much.